Let's open up God's Word. It will be up on the screen, but it would be a good idea to have it open in front of you as well. If you don't have a Bible, there are some at the back on either side, especially because of some of the names in here. So if I trip over them, we'll know what they're supposed to be when we're actually going through the passage. I'm going to read Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 21. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 3 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Fantastic. Do keep your Bibles open if you've got them open, and if not, if you've just closed them, turn back to page 884, where you'll find Daniel chapter 1. There's a book called Terrible Maps, which, as you might guess, is a book about terrible maps. And the author of this book, Michael Howe, he shares them online as well, or other ones that he adds to. I wanted to share with you just a few of them as we get going. For this first map, the country that is in yellow, that's the countries that have never had a prime minister. Only one. I think that's Switzerland, isn't it? And the countries that are in green are countries that have never eaten their prime minister. The country in red has an interesting story to tell. You can look that one up in your own time. The next one, this is a map of preferred accompaniment to your fish and chip shop chips. So for where we are located, we're in the orange region, and we therefore prefer to have curry sauce. Who prefers curry sauce with their chips? Yeah, seems all right, yeah. There we go. And finally, this one is going to mess with your head. This is Europe if it were in Asia. So what the author has done is essentially taken a map of Asia and flipped it horizontally and labelled it. So Japan has become the UK, for example. And you can try and work out what the other countries are. It messes with your head. But it's weird seeing boundaries of countries altered, changed like this. It messes with your head because boundaries matter, don't they? Well, I think we can get those maps off the screen now. We're on to Daniel, not conformed, but transformed. Now, I want to ask a question as we get going with Daniel, the whole book, but Daniel chapter 1. What do we make of that boundary line between those who are Christians and those who aren't? Between the church and the world, if you like. Or if you want to use a more positive term than boundary, because it sounds like an exclusion zone or something like that. What about the connection point between Christians and those who aren't? And what I mean by that is, if you're not a Christian in the room, what is it when you come into contact with the Christian faith, when you come to that connection point as a non-Christian with other Christians, what do you make of it? What is it that makes Christians stick out? What is it that makes them different? Are there perhaps aspects that you find attractive, warmed to? Or are there aspects of a Christians that you think, I'm not sure about that. I'm not yet feeling I want to commit to that. Or if you are a Christian, where is the connection point? Where is the boundary or connection point where your faith meets the rest of the world? So it might be for you in school or college, if you're a bit younger, or a teacher. It might be in the workplace where everyone knows that you're a Christian. Perhaps they even take the mick from time to time or ask you lots of questions. It might be in your family, in your social circles, with your neighbours, with a community group that you belong to. Where is that connection, that boundary line with the rest of the world? And what is it that makes you stick out? What is it that makes it obvious that you are a Christian? And is there something there? Now, I want you to hold those thoughts in your head as we go through this first chapter, but it's going to be helpful for the whole of the book as we go through until Christmas. Now, as this book begins, we're in the year 605 BC, 605 years before Jesus was born. And God's people were not in a good place. It's a time period called the exile, a time of history called the exile. And this chapter is an introduction to the whole book, and it gives us two key themes that come up throughout the whole book. So the first of those themes is that even in seeming defeat, God remains sovereign. You see, the whole point of the exile is that it looked like spectacular defeat, both for God's people, but also for God himself as well. And yet it was all according to God's plan. Let me take you even further back in history, to the time of Moses. And he was given God's instructions to give to the people. And he said, if you don't follow God's ways, then he will send you all kinds of warnings, troubles that come your way, that warn you to do what is right. But if you still ignore God's ways, then eventually he will kick you out of the land that he has kindly given to you. And then after Moses, a long time later, as they were settled in the land, God gave them kings to lead the people. And sometimes those kings were good. They followed God's ways. And as went the kings, so went the people. So when the kings were following God's ways, all was good. The people prospered in the land. But when they didn't, just as Moses had said, God allowed hardship to come their way to try and wake them up and shake them into following God's ways. And by and large, there was more negativity than positivity. There was more of going against God's ways than following God's ways. And so by the year 605 BC, this period of history called the exile finally began for the southern kingdom of God's people. And verse 1 gives us the historical details here. You've got this king called Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the Jewish people. He's in his third year. And then Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he besieges the main city, Jerusalem, in Israel, and he wins. He defeats the Israelites, the Jews. The king is captured. Lots of citizens are taken. the temple is ransacked, and they are all carted off to Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And this defeat happened in this series of waves of defeat that happened over several years. And the final fall of Jerusalem was the year 587 BC. So a couple of decades of defeat after defeat before the final carting off to Babylon and exile. I want you to notice as well in the details here, in verse 2, the articles of the temple of God, the God of Israel, so the objects of worship that were in the temple of God, the God of Israel, they are now placed in the temples of the Babylonian gods, the idols of Babylon. And that is quite significant because that conveys how defeated not only the people were, but how defeated God looked. This is proper defeat. The gods of Babylon have won. So it would look. But I also want you to then see in the detail who is behind this defeat that has happened. I mean, yes, it's Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king who's championed the army and won the battle, Nebuchadnezzar. But is he who's really in charge here? Well, verse 2 tells us that it's the Lord who is in charge. It is God, the God of Israel, who has brought about his own seeming defeat. And this theme continues throughout the book of God. Although he looks defeated, he's actually in charge of everything that's going on. So verse 9 tells us that God causes the officials to be favorable to Daniel. In verse 17, it is God who gave knowledge and understanding to Daniel and his friends. God is still in control. God is sovereign. And whenever it looks like we're in a situation of failure, like everything's gone wrong, God hasn't taken his eye off the ball. He's still in control. When it looks like everything is over, when it looks like everything's gone wrong, God is still there. God is over time and space and history. He is still entirely, utterly sovereign over everything. I wonder, how does that make you feel? How do you respond to the idea that God is sovereign, that he is completely and utterly in charge of everything, even when things go wrong? How does that make you feel? You see, I wonder if perhaps some of us might feel nervous about God being in charge, God being in control of your life, because naturally we want to be in charge of our own lives, don't we? We want to be the master of our fate and the captain of our soul. And that's all well and good when things are going okay, when things are smooth in life, but what about when things overtake us in life and we feel well out of our depth, like they would have done here? Well, growing up as a child, a couple of times, my dad did something. I discussed this with my dad last night, and wasn't sure if I should tell this story, but I'm going to tell it as though we were on a campsite, okay, so off the roads. My dad would let me sit on his lap sometimes while the car was in motion, and he would let me take control of the steering wheel. Did anyone else do this? Yeah. A few of you. There we go. I'm comfortable. Don't tell the police, okay? Years ago. So my dad would let me sit on the lap, I'd take control of the steering wheel, and it would be like I'm the one in control here. I'm the one driving the car. But if it was ever the case that I was veering off towards a fence or a tent or a caravan or whatever else, he was in control ultimately. He had his feet on the pedals. He could press the brakes at any moment, but he could also wrestle the steering wheel out of my hands. I wasn't that strong. And it's like that with God. He allows us to do things in our lives that are like we've got control of our lives, but ultimately he's the one who is in control underneath us in that sense. He's got the pedals at his feet. He's able to take the wheel in that sense. So in his sovereignty, as he sometimes allows hard things to come our way, tough times for us to experience, he's often, well, he's always there, but he's sometimes doing that to make us even realize that we haven't got full control of our lives. Sometimes he lets things go wrong just so that we can realize that he is actually in charge of life, the universe, and everything. So God is sovereign over every detail of our lives, when things are going right as much as when things are going wrong. But before we go on to the second theme, I want you to see the gospel picture that is in all of this. So what's going on here? God, in his sovereignty, allows himself to look defeated so that he can deal with his people's sin. Because that's why they were in exile, because of their sin. And the same happened in an even greater sense at the cross. In Jesus' death, it looked like defeat. It looked like evil had finally overcome all goodness. The true righteous one, Jesus, was overtaken by evil. The one without sin was being overcome by hell itself. It looked like defeat, but it was in those very moments that Jesus was paying fully for his people's sin. And that meant that he broke the power of evil. He frees his people from the grip of the evil one, meaning we are liberated. We are free from sin, death, hell, and the devil. Which means for us who are God's people, that is our experience. Our sin has been dealt with by the seeming defeat of God's own Son on the cross. Let's go on to our second theme. Even in seeming defeat, his people are to remain faithful. So let's go back to the boundary lines between us who are Christians and those who aren't, or the opposite way if you're not yet a Christian. Wherever the boundary line for you is it obvious that you're a Christian? Or if you're not a Christian, is it obvious that the people that you look at who are Christians are Christians? There are some ways in which it shouldn't be obvious. And back in the story, Daniel and 3 of his friends, they're taken from Israel, they're taken to Babylon, and they go through this education program. They're taught all about Babylon for 3 years. They get a degree in Babylon, if you like. And on the one hand, this was Babylon's way of indoctrinating them, trying to make them integrated into the culture so they wouldn't stand out too much. But on the other hand, this was just a way of helping them to live in the land that they now have to live in, the new world where they would have to live for around 70 years or so. So by going through this program of teaching, they would know the history, the literature, the language. They're even given these new Babylonian names that you can look at in verse 7 and try and pronounce those for yourself. So in some ways, Daniel and his friends, they look no different to everyone else around them. They fit in with their culture. And to some extent, as Christians, we are to fit in with our culture. Think about it this way. If we're supposed to follow Jesus, and Jesus wore a tunic and sandals, should we wear tunics and sandals? Well, obviously not, because none of you are doing so. Well, you might have sandals on, I can't see all of your feet, and if you do, that's fine. But none of you wear tunics, at least. None of us here are deliberately dressed like a first century rabbi, are we? So we know this instinctively. We know that we're not supposed to copy everything of the first century and be completely weird from our culture around us. But there are other ways that our faithfulness to God should make us Firstly, distinct. We should be distinct. See, in the story, Daniel decides that eating the king's food is a step too far in the integration with society. We don't know exactly why. There are a few possible reasons. It could have been that the food was associated with idol worship. Perhaps eating the food showed too great a submission to the king and reliance upon him. Or maybe the food broke Jewish kosher laws. We don't know exactly because it doesn't say. Perhaps it was even all of those reasons. But whatever the reason going on, eating the king's food was a step too far for Daniel. He was faithful to a higher king than the king of Babylon. And for us, whatever our boundary line is, whatever our connection point is with the rest of the world, at some point, we're going to have to say no. We're going to have to say no to what everyone else is doing in the culture around us if we are Christians. At some point, we're going to have to say, I serve a higher king than everyone else around me. It might be in school that as all of your friends are doing one thing or another, perhaps it's vaping, and you think, well, if I vape, I'll fit in and everyone will accept me. But then you think, well, as a Christian, I ought to obey the laws of the land, and they don't permit me at my age to do that. And you think, I want to honor God with my body as well. And it's one way of standing out. Or it might be using bad language that everyone else in school, in the workplace, is using. It might be in the workplace watching everyone be workaholics, that they're filling every hour and minute of their life working as hard as they can, and that's the culture of the office or the school that you're in. Or maybe it's the opposite, where everyone is trying to slack off as much as they can, get away with doing as little as possible. And you think, if I either work so much as everyone else or work as little as I can, I'll fit in better and I'll make more friends. But as Christians, we're sometimes called to stand out. It might be through avoiding drunkenness. It could be not going along with the gossip that's going on. Maybe it's having control of our temper that means we stand out. Or any number of things that we're called to be as Christians, but that make us stick out like a sore thumb when we're in that connection point with the rest of the world. Now, doing this is no easy thing, is it? If we've ever faced this head on, where we feel the pressure to fit in with everyone else, but we know that doing so goes against our convictions as a Christian, it's not easy. It's not easy to do that. But we should want to serve a higher king. We should want to be faithful to him. So we are called at times to be distinct as Christians. But when we are distinct, it would be very easy to be quite unreasonable or demanding in the ways that we go about it. But that's not what Daniel was like. Instead, he is, secondly, humble in his approach. Rather than insisting on his rights for pleading religious tolerance with the king of Babylon, instead, he simply asks the official, hey, would it be okay if I didn't have the king's food? The official actually says no. The official is worried that if Daniel looks worse by the end of, by eating vegetables and water, he's worried that his head will be asked for. So he says no. But then rather than giving up, Daniel then goes to the guard and negotiates with the guard who's in immediate responsibility for him. And he suggests this test. He negotiates and says, give us 10 days. 10 days of vegetables and water, and then see what we look like after that. And if they look worse, so be it. Now, we should be distinct, but the way that we go about it, it shouldn't be that of demanding, arguing, kicking up a fight at every given opportunity, protesting, rioting. Instead, there ought to be a great humility about our distinctiveness. Because there's nothing self-righteous about us to kick a fuss up about. Our distinctiveness comes from one who is higher than us, not from us ourselves. And so we ought to have this great humility about us. We can ask, we can negotiate, we can reason with people about pursuing our distinct ways as Christians. What's the outcome of the story, though? Well, the outcome shows that Daniel's distinctiveness is thirdly honoured by God. 10 days is up, and Daniel and his friends, they actually look fitter, healthier, stronger than the others. And so the guard takes away all of the meat, all of the wine, and gives all of the people vegetables and water. I can well imagine Daniel was really popular with the rest of the people. But by the end of the chapter, the king looks at these four friends, Daniel and the others, and he sees that they are far better than the others. In fact, he sees that they are superior to the rest of his enchanters and magicians in the whole of his kingdom. You see that in verse 20. And this wasn't because of Daniel's diet, by the way. So we're not given an example necessarily to follow here in terms of our diet. Some of you will be very pleased to hear that. But this was God's intervention. This was God's work to make them stronger and wiser than the rest. God has honoured their commitment to remain faithful to him through this distinct diet that they were on. But we do need to be clear here. That doesn't always mean we'll have an easy ride if we seek to be faithful to God. It doesn't mean we'll always be successful. It doesn't mean it will go like it did for Daniel necessarily for us. Sometimes being faithful to God will mean it costs us heavily in our jobs or even of our jobs. It might cost us in our families. It might cost us in our friendship groups. But even then, he will honour our faithfulness to him. Because as we are distinctly faithful to God, even when it costs us, he will honour it by using it for some good in our lives and for his glory. So that God will honour us doesn't necessarily mean it will be easy. It may even be harder. It doesn't mean we'll be successful. We may lose out on a lot of things. But it does mean that in some way he will honour our commitment to be faithful to him. We have Daniel as an example in this, but even more than Daniel, we have Jesus as our ultimate example of faithfulness. His righteousness was incredibly distinct. His love for sinners, his compassion upon the needy really stood out. And rather than lording it over others as he would have been perfectly capable of doing as the Lord of the universe, instead he had a gentle, humble spirit. And his faithfulness was honoured. His faithfulness cost him greatly as it took him to the cross. But he was raised up from death, raised up to the right hand of the Father. His faithfulness was honoured by God. And so our supreme example, though we get help from Daniel, our supreme example, the one Daniel himself points to, is Jesus, the faithful one. Now, as we wrap up, I just want to connect these two together, because I think if we leave it here, we could easily take a misstep on this. So what is it that makes us faithful? After all, it's not the case that our faithfulness earns us a standing with God. No amount of faithfulness on our part will ever take away any of our sin and pay for anything of what we've done wrong. How these two connect, it is our faithfulness that is in response to God's sovereign salvation. It's because he, in his sovereignty, has dealt with our sin by looking defeated in the death of his Son, that then moves us to be faithful to him. As we trust in what has been done for us by Jesus on the cross, so that inspires and empowers us to be faithful followers of God. Think of it like this. In dating, or whatever you want to call it these days, in dating, someone has to make the first move, don't they? Someone has to say, I kind of like you. You know, playing it down as young teenagers try and do. Or I have feelings for you. Or whatever you're supposed to say. Someone has to make the first move. And then the other person can respond by entering into that relationship, by being faithful in that relationship. And that's kind of a small picture of how it works for us with Jesus. He has made the move towards us. That's his sovereignty, that's his salvation that he brings to us. He's made the move towards us. He's showed us his love, not in the downplayed way of teenagers, but in the full expression of his love that took him to the cross where he died for our sin. He has shown us his love. He's put himself out there in that sense, and he's looking for us to respond back to his demonstration of love. He's looking for us to respond by saying, yes, we love you too. We love you back. And if you're not yet a Christian, that is your move to make. He's shown you his love on the cross. Will you respond by saying, yes, I love you back. I want to be yours. I want to follow you. And then the call is to respond in faithfulness. As is expected in relationships, we respond by sticking with the one who has loved us to this extent, who has loved us to the point of death. If he's loved us that much, how could we not do anything but be faithful to him? How could we not live for him and exclusively for him? The driving force of our faithfulness to God is on what Jesus has done for us and in us.